Thank you for joining us for our second webinar in the Weil Digital Health Series. Today, we're going to be talking and discussing about the regulatory landscape and reimbursement strategies for digital health innovations. I'm Lisa Placanica. I'm the Senior Managing Director for the Center of Technology Licensing for the Weill Cornell Medical Campus of Cornell University. Today, we have a great group of panelists here. We have Sally Bowden, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Renalytix AI, a startup company or a new located in New York City. Melissa Hudzik, a senior counsel for Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, who's a specialist with reimbursement matters relating to digital health. And Vernessa Pollard, who's a partner at McDermott, Weill, and Emery, who's an expert on regulatory matters relating to digital health. Today, our format is going to be a little different if you joined us for the first webinar. Melissa and Vernessa will give a short presentation covering kind of the brass tacks aspects and information you need to know for regulatory and reimbursement matters. And Sally will talk about sort of the commercial journey of a company in this space. So without further ado, I'd like Vernessa to tell us about the regulatory landscape for digital health.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been practicing food and drug law for, 19 of my 22 or so years of practice. And as I've practiced in this area, I've really seen the law and the spectrum evolve to where we are today, with digital health sort of being where healthcare is going, where it will continue to be. There are lots of opportunities and lots of regulatory challenges. And so I'm happy to walk through some of the FDA considerations. If we could have the slides, please. So next slide. Let me just scroll through. So this slide, I think, is an interesting way to try to illustrate what we're seeing and what we mean when we talk about digital health. We are increasingly seeing lots of new players in this space. And where we see healthcare going in digital health is the idea of the connected patient. So in this slide, you see a patient that is tracking different types of biometric data, maybe using apps or wearables or auxiliary devices that may even control the delivery of other medications. All of this information that the consumer is generating or patient is controlling then can go into electronic healthcare records. And in this paradigm, we have healthcare providers who are looking to access this information for telehealth or treatment or to control medication or dosing. You may have caregivers who are monitoring patient health and data. Increasingly, we're seeing pharmaceutical companies, researchers who are looking to access and leverage data for product development, for clinical trials. And then we have payers and employers who are looking at these kinds of data and using these tools for population health management or to authorize treatment. So it's a very sort of active and robust ecosystem, lots of regulatory considerations. So this next slide, whenever I talk about digital health, if we could go to the next slide, I always like to start with this slide or some version of it. While I'm going to focus today on the FDA regulatory issues, I always think it's helpful to be mindful of the other regulators here beyond FDA. And we'll talk about reimbursement, Melissa will, and CMS, but there are lots of other regulators, and what is both challenging and exciting is their regulatory strategies are not always aligned. They have different regulatory priorities, and the strategy that you employ, let's say for your FDA clearance or product approval, needs to be deployed with an eye towards how that strategy may implicate other regulatory requirements such as data privacy, or your physician relationships, because all of these other regulators in this cloud, let's say, are also focused on digital health. And outside of the cloud, we also have the class action bar. And what we're seeing are these emerging theories of product liability that relate to the performance and safety of digital health tools. So very dynamic space. And so proceed with an eye towards all of these different regulators. So on this next slide, we'll talk a little bit about FDA. FDA is focused very much on digital health. And at a high level, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gives FDA the authority to regulate the manufacture, development, advertising, and promotion of drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, food, dietary supplements, and tobacco products. So a lot of authority and very different regulatory regimes for these products. For FDA's purposes, the agency has been focused on digital health issues for probably about the last 10 years or so. And their regulatory strategy has really been focused on these 4 areas. Because of the pace of innovation for some of these technologies, the agency has had to re-examine whether the traditional pathways to market need to be revised or changed to fit the way that software as a medical device or AI technologies are developed. So we are seeing an increase in the use of the breakthrough pathway, which is an expedited path to market for innovative digital health technologies. The agency has created or explored a pilot program that would be sort of a pre-certification pathway for software as a medical device. Increasingly with data and the interoperability or wireless connectivity going into medical devices, FDA has issued guidance advising developers that they need to consider interoperability of connected devices as a part of safety and thinking about the product development. We've also seen FDA issue guidance documents advising medical device and software developers that cybersecurity is now a subsystem essentially of quality, and that developers need to think about how they protect data that's in the devices or that drives outcomes as a part of both pre-market strategy and development and post-market safety. And then finally, the agency is focused on advertising and promotion and making sure that the instructions for use for these technologies, which don't necessarily exist in traditional labeling or a package insert, still convey the necessary information for the user to understand how to safely use these products and the limitations on their use. And as we will see, where FDA has sort of stepped back in terms of regulating some of the general health and wellness, the non-diagnostic tools, we're seeing regulators like the Federal Trade Commission and the state attorneys general step in to regulate particularly the advertising and promotion of these products to ensure that the claims about their performance and safety are substantiated and are not misleading or deceptive. So again, very active regulatory landscape here. Next slide. So in determining whether your solution or product is a medical device, intended use becomes a very important threshold consideration. At a high level, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act states that a product's regulatory status depends on its intended use. And we'll see how that plays out when we look at the definition of a medical device and why FDA has the authority to regulate software based on its intended use. So intended use refers to the intent of the person who's responsible for marketing the product. And your intent is shown by your claims about the product, the statements that you make or others make on your behalf, so influencers, testimonials about the product, and what it's capable of doing. And I chose here on this slide a warning letter. And there are two things that are important about this. This warning letter is from 2005. So it's illustrating that FDA's focus on digital health and software as a medical device is not a new or novel concept. But what's also interesting about this warning letter is that it involves software. In this case, FDA says in the warning letter, we reviewed your website. And your website talks about the fact that your software system is intended for use to help pathologists detect, count, classify, and evaluate cancer cells. So based on that statement on the company's website, FDA in 2005 took the position that your software is a medical device, right? Because it is intended for a diagnostic purpose. So this is really illustrative of why understanding what the intended use of your product is and how the claims that you make and how you position it in the marketplace can affect whether and to what extent it is FDA regulated or not. Next slide. So the whole sort of underlying regulatory structure for software as a medical device for digital health within FDA is based on the legal definition of what a medical device is. And this definition is probably 90 years old. It's been in the law for a very long time. And the statute is very broad, which is what gives FDA the authority to sweep in to the medical device definition a whole host of things like toothbrushes and surgical gloves. Those are all currently regulated as medical devices. So based on this definition of a medical device as an instrument, an apparatus, a machine, a contrivance is usually what FDA thinks of as software, including any component part or accessory of that instrument that is intended for use, that concept again, in the diagnosis, treatment, cure, prevention, mitigation of a disease or condition. Very broad. Or intended to affect the structure and function of the body. And three, the third prong is, doesn't depend on being metabolized in the body to achieve these things. And that third prong is what differentiates a medical device from a drug or a biologic. But as you can see, the definition is very broad. So it sweeps in a whole host of things that FDA either does not have the regulatory bandwidth to regulate, or devices that may be low risk. So the next slide shows kind of how FDA and Congress has tried to address the breadth of this medical device definition and to carve out of that definition certain categories of software that are not medical devices. The 21st Century Cures Act contained a provision that changed the medical device definition. And specifically, that provision excluded or exempted from medical devices 5 broad categories of software. I'm not going to force you to try to read the fine print on this slide, but at a high level, the following categories of software are not considered medical devices. So if it's health administration software, your sort of back-end office software where you're using it to process claims or make reimbursement or coverage decisions, generally not a medical device. The second category is sort of general wellness software, and those are your lifestyle types of tools, your health trackers that track your sleep or track your steps, that provide general patient education, not medical devices. Most electronic medical records, not medical devices, unless they integrate a software component that is providing a diagnostic or other medical device function. And then medical device data systems. These are systems that simply move data from one medical device to a platform where it can be reviewed without analyzing the data for diagnostic purposes. So that means that most telemedicine platforms, not medical devices, most APIs that are just moving data from one platform to another, also not regulated. And then the fifth category broadly are clinical decision support tools. But there's an important caveat here. So most clinical decision support tools where the inflow of data and the basis for the decisions are known and knowable to the healthcare provider are either not regulated as medical devices, or they may be subject to enforcement discretion, which means that FDA's chosen not to regulate them. The caveat, however, is if the clinical decision support is analyzing clinical images for the purpose of patient diagnosis, or if it's structured in a way where the provider has to rely solely on the output of that tool to make a diagnostic or treatment decision, then it's likely to be regulated. And so while the statute has carved out a lot of things from the medical device definition, there are lots of shades of gray, and sometimes crossing the FDA threshold can be a matter of changing your claims or changing the functionality or the integration of your software tool. So next slide. So these next two slides, I'll walk through very quickly how FDA has tried to help with interpreting the 21st Century Cures Act. And these are sort of key guidance documents that are helpful reference points. I won't go through them in detail, but at a high level, the general wellness guidance here, number one, provides examples of low-risk devices, including software, that FDA is not going to regulate as medical devices. The clinical decision support guidance walks through FDA's approach for thinking about which types of clinical decision support tools will be medical devices and which will not be. And then the third policy here on this slide is the policy on mobile medical applications and other software functions. This policy identifies categories of mobile apps and other software functions that are not going to be regulated as medical devices. Next slide. Okay, so the other three guidance documents that are important reference point is the changes to existing medical software policy. This is the policy where FDA clarifies that tools that are simply moving medical data from one platform to another are not going to be regulated. And this is what we rely on for the position that most telemedicine platforms are not going to be medical devices simply because they are facilitating an episode of care. The draft guidance on multifunction devices is important because it states the proposition that where a medical device or software component lives in a broader platform, let's say if you have a wearable, a wrist-worn wearable that provides multiple functions, but one of the functions is a medical device, like an ECG function, only the ECG function in that platform will be regulated as a medical device. So it really stands for the proposition that if you integrate medical device software into a broader platform, FDA will not regulate the entire platform as a medical device simply because one component or one software component is a medical device. Instead, it'll focus on the medical device component, but it will want to understand how the software integrates in the broader system. And then the final guidance that's important is what FDA's framework, where it proposes to regulate prescription drug software, either as a form of labeling for the prescription drug or as a form of promotional labeling or advertisement. So if you are developing an app that's intended to enhance the safety or functionality of a prescription drug by providing education or information about that drug, you need to assess whether the app or the output of that tool would be considered a form of labeling for the drug, and what are the regulatory requirements that apply to that. So in this next slide, where we land is here. That the subset of things that FDA is really regulating as medical devices are fairly small. And those tend to be things that are diagnostic in nature or that are really driving treatment of the patient or treatment decisions. Next slide. So key questions to think about as you assess whether your software tool is a medical device. First, is it intended for diagnosis or treatment? That could be medical care, it could be disease prevention. If yes, is the software exempt? Is it one of those 5 categories that's exempt under Section 3060 of the Cures Act? If it is one of these exempt categories, then it's not a medical device. If it's not exempt under Cures, you need to ask whether the product might be subject to enforcement discretion, which means that FDA is choosing not to regulate it under any of the guidance policies or guidance documents that we just discussed. If it is subject to enforcement discretion or otherwise not regulated, then the medical device requirements don't apply. So effectively, you don't have to treat it as a medical device. If it's not subject to any of these exemptions, then it likely is a medical device. And then that brings us to kind of what are the requirements. So next slide. This slide just talks about the basic requirements for medical devices. I won't go into too much detail here, but the takeaway is that if your software is a medical device, then all of the traditional medical device requirements apply to it. Next slide. And this slide just illustrates the pathways and the different approval pathways for medical devices. Most low risk or class 1 devices don't require FDA pre-market clearance, but you have to sort of assess whether your product falls into that category or whether it would require a 510K or a PMA. Next slide. So for those software tools that are not FDA regulated medical devices, this list just goes through some considerations, and I won't go through them in detail, but again, does it comply with FTC laws? Might it be labeling for a device? Is the software intended to drive clinical trials? So are you using data? And because if so, then the way that you develop that data might be subject to good clinical practice regulations or other regulations on the use of data for human subjects or to drive product development. And I won't go through these next 2 slides in any detail, but this is just a list that sort of summarizes both the pre-market considerations and the post-market considerations to think about as you're sort of developing your regulatory strategy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Vernessa. That was great. I'm Melissa Hudzik, Senior Counsel at Wilson Sonsini in the Washington, D.C. office. I'm a healthcare regulatory attorney and a certified professional coder. I'm going to be speaking today about reimbursement for digital health products. I will cover areas that you should consider as early as possible and certainly before commercialization. I've seen many companies ready to bring their products to the market. They're waiting for their FDA clearance, but they haven't even yet considered how they're going to get paid for their product. And in certain instances, waiting for coverage or a reimbursement decision can take months. And if you haven't prepared, there are going to be months that you're just spent waiting. Next slide. The lack of consistent third-party reimbursement is a primary reason why doctors and hospitals are slow to adopt new technologies. The pace of digital healthcare products is vastly outpacing the ability of payers to keep up. This doesn't mean that reimbursement is non-existent. Sometimes it means getting creative and partnering with commercial payers who are interested in your product and will provide reimbursement when others will not. And sometimes it means partnering with a medical association who will advocate on your behalf for your product to the American Medical Association and CMS. Next slide. We're going to zone in on reimbursement by knowing your customer. If you know your customer, you can narrow in on who is going to be paying for your product. You could be selling your product direct to consumer, which is different from direct to a patient. Direct to consumer products are typically wellness products that do not require a physician prescription, and you can sell them in stores such as Target, Walgreens, CVS. Those are obviously much easier, and typically they would be cash pay customers who would just pay you directly. You could also be selling your products to physicians who will use the products in their offices, hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers who will use your product in their facilities, durable medical equipment and device suppliers who will sell your product to patients for you, durable medical equipment and device manufacturers who may incorporate your product into their own device or equipment, or other health technology companies. For example, if you have created software, you may need another digital health company to make your product work for physicians or in a hospital setting. We frequently see digital health companies package their platform with a device such as a tablet or a laptop so it can be used in an operating room or in a patient's room. But consider, for example, whether an anesthesiologist is able to monitor 2 tablets, a laptop, plus their regular monitoring screen during surgery, or whether that software can be combined with another company and used on one device. It may make your product a more attractive purchase for hospitals and physicians. Next slide. When you know your customer, you can start to know your payer. For example, if your product is direct to consumer, the payer is going to be the consumer. If your customer will be healthcare providers, hospitals, or employer occupational health organizations, your payer may be a third-party payer, such as Medicare, another federal healthcare program, such as Medicaid, a commercial health insurance company, or an employer self-funded health plan. If you'll be selling your device to a DME manufacturer or another health technology company who will incorporate your product into their device or equipment, my next few slides will likely be inapplicable because you will most likely be reimbursed by those entities instead of a third-party payer. Next slide. I'm going to focus the remainder of my time on Medicare reimbursement, and there are several reasons why. First, if you need to apply for a code, the requirements are the same for Medicare and for commercial payers. And second, oftentimes, if Medicare covers and reimburses for your product, other commercial payers will too. The first factor to consider is whether your product is in a category that Medicare will cover. Certain items and services are statutorily excluded from coverage, and Medicare simply cannot cover the products even if they wanted to. In this case, you may consider looking to a commercial insurance provider or other options for reimbursement who don't have those statutory exclusion restrictions. Next, are there similar products on the market that are covered? If so, learn as much as you can about those products. How are they reimbursed? Are they paid off of a fee schedule so that Medicare pays for the product specifically? Is payment for the product bundled into a payment for another device or for a procedure so that there's no separate payment? Companies sometimes get scared when they learn that their product will not be separately reimbursed, but many healthcare items are bundled with perhaps a procedure or a service. It's not unusual or uncommon. And one point I wanted to stress here is that if your company wants to bill Medicare directly, it must be enrolled as a provider in the Medicare program. There are rules and requirements that must be met to become a provider, and planning early, again, here is the best option because it does take time to become enrolled in Medicare. Next slide. At this point, you've done your diligence, you've looked for similar products, you've seen how they're reimbursed. If there are no similar products, you may have a few more steps on your journey, but the process will be similar. Healthcare items and services all require a code in order to be billed. This applies whether reimbursement comes from Medicare or a commercial insurance plan. There are several different types of codes that identify healthcare items and services. Category 1 CPT codes are divided into categories and generally cover healthcare services. Category 2 CPT codes are more commonly called HCPCS codes, and they cover healthcare items and some non-physician services. And then there are also Category 3 CPT codes, which are temporary codes for emerging technology, services, and procedures. Next slide. So how do you get a new code, or how do you get an existing code changed? The American Medical Association is responsible for developing new CPT codes. CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, develops new HCPCS codes, but both parties really work together throughout the processes. In both instances, you can apply for a new code or request a code change, and those require applications. To get a new CPT code from the AMA, the process takes about 18 months, sometimes even longer. The AMA has an editorial panel that only reviews submissions a few times a year. Category 1 CPT codes are updated annually and effective for use on January 1 of each year. Category 3 codes are released for reporting either January 1st or July 1st of a given CPT cycle and becomes effective 6 months after the date of release. If your product needs a HCPCS code, you will apply with CMS. There's an application deadline each quarter for drugs and biologic products, and twice per year for durable medical equipment and non-drug and non-biological items. Final FDA market approval of FDA regulated drugs or biologic products must be included with the code application and submitted before the application deadline. The application process for HCPCS codes tends to be shorter than that for CPT codes, but it can still take at least 6 months to get a new HCPCS codes. While waiting for a new HCPCS codes, it's possible to bill using a miscellaneous code. Miscellaneous codes allow suppliers to begin billing immediately for a service or item as soon as it's allowed to be marketed by the FDA, even though there's no distinct code that describes the service or item. If you're working with a specific payer, they may advise you to use a miscellaneous code while you're waiting for your application to be reviewed and approved. Keep in mind that because the code will not be specific to your product, reimbursement amounts can vary greatly. And don't just assume that you can use a miscellaneous code if you haven't gotten approval from your payer. Always check first to make sure that they will pay for that miscellaneous code for your product. Next slide. As I mentioned previously, Category 3 CPT codes are temporary codes for emerging technology, services, and procedures. The codes may be used for up to 5 years, after which they can be converted into a Category 1 code. Most of the Category 3 codes are considered experimental, investigational, and not covered by Medicare. However, some commercial payers may cover these codes, and it's not always a guarantee that they won't cover them. It's possible that you will get coverage from Medicare as well. Obtaining a Category 3 code does not require FDA approval or clearance, nor published peer-reviewed evidence for the drug or the supply. You do have to have at least one of the following: a protocol for a study of the procedures being performed, support from the specialties who will use the procedure, availability of US peer-reviewed literature, descriptions of current US trials outlining the efficacy of the procedure. And that's very important. And I would say one of the keys here is support from a specialty that will use the procedure. I mentioned very early on in my presentation that aligning yourself with a medical association will be to your benefit. And this is a great example when that medical association can advocate for your product or your device in order to get it covered by Medicare. Next slide. I wanted to spend just a minute discussing CMS's MSIT pathway. This is called the Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology Pathway for Breakthrough Devices. It's a new program from CMS intended to jumpstart reimbursement for breakthrough devices, but your product must qualify as a breakthrough device as defined by the FDA. And a breakthrough device has to meet certain requirements. It has to provide for more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human diseases or conditions. And it has to meet at least one of the following. It has to represent breakthrough technology. There has to be no approved or cleared alternative. It has to offer significant advantages over existing approved or cleared devices, or the device availability is in the best interest of the patient. And the MSIT pathway allows for coverage immediately upon FDA approval of the breakthrough device, which is huge if you're trying to get reimbursement for your particular product and it qualifies as a breakthrough device. but note that manufacturers must still obtain the appropriate code for the device. So that's, again, make sure you're working early on, make sure there's a code that either that your device qualifies for or that you have applied and are ready to go as soon as the FDA gives approval of your product. Next slide. One question that we get asked a lot is about reimbursement during clinical trials. Some commercial insurance companies do provide coverage during clinical trials, and Medicare has a clinical trial policy. They'll typically cover the routine costs of qualifying clinical trials, and a clinical trial must have the following 3 elements. The investigational item or service falls within a Medicare benefit category, and that means that it cannot be statutorily excluded from Medicare coverage. The trial must have therapeutic intent, and trials of therapeutic interventions must enroll patients with diagnosed disease rather than healthy volunteers. And trials of diagnostic interventions may enroll healthy patients to have a proper control group. And in order to qualify as a qualifying clinical trial, you have to have all of the following 7 elements. The principal purpose of the trial is to test whether the intervention potentially improves participants' health outcomes. The trial is well supported by available scientific and medical information. The trial does not unjustifiably duplicate already existing studies. The trial design is appropriate to answer the research question being asked. The trial is sponsored by a credible organization or individual capable of executing the proposed trial successfully. The trial is in compliance with federal regulations relating to the protection of human subjects. And all aspects of the trial are conducted according to the appropriate standards of scientific integrity. And so if you think you may be interested in following this route for reimbursement during a clinical trial, you do have to get approval from CMS as a qualifying clinical trial before you can start billing for those routine costs. Next slide. Thank you. This concludes my presentation, and I'm going to turn it back to Lisa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Missy and Vernessa. I think this has been a lot of fantastic information on what innovators need to think about to kind of chart a path through the regulatory and reimbursement landscape that's been changing and new. I'd like Sally to talk to everybody. Okay, now that we have this information, how do you actually go about charting a path through what it, at least for a novice, seems quite a complicated landscape to really affect sort of a commercial business development strategy to support digital health innovations?
Right, thank you. I think everything that Vernessa and Melissa presented all need to be very early considerations for anybody that is starting down a development path, whether you're a new company or a well-established one. And I think for Renalytix AI, we assembled a group, a leadership team early on when we formed the company, and we all have the bruises and the scars from doing things wrong. So we've all lived in the diagnostic space for 25 plus years. So we know all the mistakes because we've all made them. And so early on, we sat down and we put this strategy together that's been outlined nicely by Vernessa and Melissa, and said, what do we have to do early on? And even though, in this space, you're wanting to improve patient lives with whatever we're doing and what novel technologies there are, the name of the game, if you want to stay in business, is reimbursement, reimbursement, reimbursement. And so if people aren't going to pay for your product, you're not going to help anyone. And so we had to very early partner with very knowledgeable resources like Melissa on the reimbursement side to help us outline, that process. And because it is a very regimented process on reimbursement, and there's very specific dates that you have to meet, and they only come around once a year or twice a year, it's important that you know up front what that cycle looks like, and you're prepared to have, all the paperwork and everything submitted that you need to have in order to be part of that. And we had to have a unique code. And so we partnered very early on to do that. And, that then dovetails into a lot of what Vernessa was saying, is then it becomes all about intended use, which is the single most critical thing that you can align to, because not only does, it determine your potential market, your intended market, it impacts your coding, it impacts your reimbursement, and impacts, the FDA and what kind of studies you're going to have to do to support that intended use. And you have to put all of that together and create this really nice sweet spot that fulfills all these different stakeholder requirements in order to be successful. And you need to do it really early from the beginning. Otherwise, you're wasting time on studies and product development that you potentially might change down the road. So do it once and do it well. And so for us, we did that. And our first product, which is Kidney Intellex, is a combination of a traditional, wet lab-based biomarker test with an AI-derived algorithmic component. And we could easily have launched this as an LDT, and we did launch it as an LDT as part of our strategy to eat the elephant kind of one bite at a time. Went through New York State approval, but part of our mission early on for financing was we listed on the London Stock Exchange, and subsequently we are listed on NASDAQ as well. But we have all of this, all these eyes on us to make sure we're doing everything to the highest level of quality. So from day one, we said, yep, we may be initially launching an LDT, but we're going to de-risk that by doing a single site IVD submission to FDA. So we're going to build our quality system from day one to the highest standard. So we put a quality system in place that met ISO 13485, that met the FDA QSR requirements, that met ISO 27001, which is all of the cybersecurity elements as well. And so we just built it that way from day one. And we've taught our laboratorians that we are not just a CLIA lab, this is our manufacturing space, and we're running it that way. And that really has set us apart from, I think, a lot of other AI companies or AI developers, because the feedback we get, at least from our investors and the community that comes in and does due diligence on our systems, is that a lot of AI companies aren't taking it to that level. They don't have that rigor in their quality system. And so we wanted to do that from day one. And that has served us well with partnering with Big Pharma, who does conduct pretty in-depth due diligence. And they do want that access to the AI and the digital solutions that we can offer. Also related to reimbursement, we did apply for breakthrough device designation very early on as part of our strategy, and we were awarded that. Lucky for us, we didn't know MSIT was coming, so that worked in our favor on the reimbursement side. But those were all, things that we looked to do and mapped out super early. And now we just have been executing to that plan and executing quite quickly and successfully. So I just can't stress enough to do all the things that Vernessa and Melissa have said and do it very early and partner with really good resources to walk you through that path. None of us know every process. None of us are experts in all of them, but there are definitely people that are, and you need to bring those folks in to walk you through those processes and down those paths just to help you be successful, because it is tricky to navigate. And you want somebody that does that every day to help you.
Great. Thank you, Sally. So we have time to take questions. If you'd like to submit any questions, please feel free to use the question and answer function of Zoom, and we can kind of track those. I think I'd like to kick it off with one question. So Sally, you had said, oh, well, we didn't know MIST was coming, and it came, which is, I guess, related to sort of digital health is still somewhat new. The regulatory and reimbursement frameworks are sort of new. How set are they? So I guess that's for Melissa and Vernessa. Like, do you see these changing or evolving significantly in the near and long-term future? And then for Sally, how as a commercial entity, do you manage that risk of a sort of ever evolving or ever changing regulatory and reimbursement landscape, both for your products that are on the market and the products that are in your development pipeline? So I don't know, Vernessa and Melissa, do you want to comment first on, is this going to change a lot and when?
Sure, I'll jump in first just on the reimbursement side. I think things are going to have to change. One of the questions I answered by text was that I think if anything, this time during COVID has shown us that digital health really is the future of healthcare, and that the technology is here to stay. It's working. It's keeping patients out of the physician's offices. It's getting patients out of the hospital and back into their houses, rather than spending, lengthy times in hospitals with people who are much sicker. So I think this has really shown us that the technology is here to stay. I think reimbursement is going to have to catch up. I think things will be rapidly changing, unfortunately, for companies just coming. I don't think that necessarily the payment pathways that we have now are going to be the same payment pathways that we have a year from now, 2 years from now. So I do think that things will be changing. I think it's super exciting. I can't wait to see where things are going to go. But I think it will be a bit of a ride during the next few years.
Yeah, I agree with that from the standpoint of the FDA regulatory landscape. I think just from looking at where FDA was in 2011, when it issued the guidance that everyone thought was revolutionary, that apps that sit on a mobile platform could be a medical device. And there was like a collective, gasp in the industry to where the agency is today. I have been accused at times, because I spent my formative years as a lawyer at FDA, of being an FDA apologist, but I do think that the agency is doing a phenomenal job to try to adapt these very old laws that didn't contemplate any of the things that we're talking about, to meet the unique challenges of iterating and developing digital health. And I think we're seeing this particularly with things like AI, where the models have to be trained. You have to think about things like diversity and inclusivity of your training sets. And what we've seen is that FDA has pushed out a lot of guidance documents. They're not all perfect. They don't answer all the questions. But I've seen them sort of evolve to being much more in the mindset of partnering with and learning from innovative companies like Sally's and others in the industry, to try to figure out how to balance risk with the benefits of the product. So I see, just a lot of evolution in the regulatory landscape.
I agree with that so much, Vernessa. Our experience with FDA for this particular product, and I've got 3 different AI submissions in with FDA right now for various clients, but they have been very collaborative, and it's exactly what you're talking about. It is everybody's learning, we're all evolving, and we're all trying to figure it out. And I think if you do bring everything back down to risk, and you have a reasonable plan in place to mitigate whatever risk exists for the product, I am finding that FDA has been very collaborative around that. And so I think that it just is all about building a good relationship with your review team, and getting in there and explaining the product and the risk and your proposal, and you'll come to a happy place, a reasonable place with them.
So Sally, I guess a question there, like how do you engage and develop this relationship with the FDA? Is it anybody can come knock on the door and they're there to help guide you, or do you need a facilitator to help connect with the right people to get this kind of guidance and discussion going?
Sure. So first of all, anybody could. I think, again, like I said earlier, it helps to surround yourself with people who kind of know the ropes, and know the people and the processes. So if you have a partner that is in FDA a lot, and that knows the people, that knows the leadership, that has those relationships that can help with that facilitation, I think that's really helpful. There is the pre-submission, the Q-submission process, that you can submit information and ask questions and get face-to-face meetings with FDA or phone calls. We're not doing too many face-to-face meetings, too many of those with FDA these days. But, it also is helpful to have somebody that has been in the trenches with FDA, because they're not perfect. Your review teams aren't perfect. They're human just like we are. And sometimes you need to go to the managerial level, the Jeff Shurins, the Tim Stenzel level, and say, hey, you know, we're really at an impasse. What do you recommend? My review team just really isn't, you know, understanding this is not a high risk device and they're being a little unreasonable. Help me. And they will. They can, you know, get the log jams out of the way while supporting the review team, but also making sure that industry is being supported and moving down the path of least burdensome approach. So it does help to have folks that know those processes and know the people.
Great. I have a few questions that are kind of touching on similar areas, really relating to reimbursement and kind of commercial adoption. So how much does whatever reimbursement model you choose to pursue affect adoption by, say, a large healthcare system, and by uptake by providers, insurance companies, and consumers? And is that, do you take that into account when trying to choose your reimbursement model, or do you just say, okay, this is the reimbursement model we're going to pursue, and try to explore that?
I think it's huge, and I think it depends. I've seen a lot of success lately with companies finding one particular payer and partnering with them and rolling out whatever their model is to that particular payer first to see how it's adopted before they go perhaps to all payers or Medicare. In fact, I would highly recommend that approach. Payers for right now are really interested, I think, in reimbursing for digital health where Medicare is not. And so there's been a lot of success there. I would say in terms of Medicare reimbursement for hospitals and facilities, it's huge. If your product is not going to be covered, most likely, those entities just aren't going to adopt it, unfortunately. And so I think if your strategy is to get into a hospital or an ambulatory surgery center, absolutely plan early to get that Medicare coverage, because otherwise it just won't be adopted. That's my personal opinion. I think in the physician office side, it really depends. Medicare, again, is huge. If Medicare covers it, the physicians are probably going to be excited about it. That said, one thing to keep in mind, and I didn't mention it during my presentation, is consider the reimbursement amount. This is, again, an area where I think companies just automatically assume they're going to make a lot of money and cover the cost of their product. And then sometimes when it's very late in the game, they realize that they're not even going to cover their costs with Medicare's reimbursement rate. And that would be an example of when they may need to pivot strategies, or when they need to get into the door with Medicare and figure out some other method for reimbursement that will at least allow them to cover their costs. Especially with new technology being so expensive, sometimes reimbursement rates are really low and companies just aren't even able to cover their basic minimum. And it's really unfortunate. And again, planning early, #1 strategy.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of Melissa's point, I think it's really important to align your FDA regulatory strategy with your reimbursement pathway, and to do that early on, because the intended use of your product, the indications for use, the data that you submit to FDA to support those endpoints around safety and efficacy can affect how the device, or whether the device gets coded or adopted, right, by private or public payers. And so really making sure that if you're classifying the device as a radiology device or as an accessory to something, that there is a code. And also if part of your reimbursement strategy is about efficacy for an endpoint like adherence or improving efficiencies, you need to think about the data, right, that you've developed to really support and demonstrate from an FDA standpoint and from the payer standpoint that your tool is actually effective and will deliver those results.
Great. So kind of a follow-up question. There's been a handful of these. I think we've talked and gotten the point across great that we have to think about these things early and set your strategy early. But what does early mean? Is this pre-company formation? Is this series seed money? You should definitely be taking a chunk of that seed money and putting toward regulatory and reimbursement experts. Like, how early is too early, or how early is too late, I guess, is a way to phrase this. Like, what does early mean?
So I've definitely seen pre-seed companies starting to think about it. And I say that would probably be my ideal strategy. You don't have to necessarily act upon it, but start developing those plans. And that way, when you get the seed funding, maybe you can start putting in a little bit of the effort. I would say don't wait until you're ready to bring it to market. That is just too late. So yeah, pre-seed, start thinking about it. As you move on, put those plans into action.
I guess, Sally, a related kind of question for that. So, we've set very early, so almost pre-company formation or at the time of inception. So how can a young company who's maybe new to the space or new to the marketplace bring the experts they need to the table to sit on their boards and provide this guidance? Like what are some strategies to kind of get the expertise that you need to kind of navigate this path?
Sure. So young companies are cash poor, right? So they don't have a lot of cash flow. So I think what you'll find is there are a lot of folks that are willing to be advisors in exchange for equity. So there's no cash exchange. They're willing to come and sit on an advisory board and provide all this counsel and guidance, knowing that somewhere down the road there will be a listing on the stock exchange or an IPO or something, and then they can take some equity on the back end. So there are a lot of really great folks out there that are willing to work with startups, because I think once you get to be decades in this business, we get excited about the technology and the potential. And we want to see people be successful. So it becomes less about a paycheck and more about the success of the company. And there's a lot of advisors that really just want to partner and see the success, come.
Great. A question for Vernessa. So there seems gray areas, right? Something maybe is not going to be regulated or maybe will be regulated. And you can see how a company might make a decision to go on the let's go non-FDA regulated because it's cheaper, quicker, easier. But what are some of the, I guess, risks or tensions that can be associated with that if you're trying to kind of walk that line of selling something, but not for an intended use to diagnose, right? So how can a company manage that if that's their business decision?
I think it is really key to have alignment between your marketing teams and sales teams and your regulatory and compliance functions within the company. Because often it's possible to have a multi-step strategy where you launch first with a very limited intended use that is in the health and wellness space while you're developing the clinical data and evidence to support something that might be regulated or require, a 510K. And so I think the way to walk the line is simple: develop your master claim sheet. So all the things that you want to say this tool does, you can develop a matrix for it. And then what's your evidence? What's your studies? What data do you have to support those statements? And then once you've done that and you've created that matrix of claims, where you want to say it and all of the context behind it, have somebody who has expertise review those claims and make sure that the claims you want to make are in the health and wellness space. But then you need to train your sales teams to make sure that their messaging and the campaigns that they're developing align with that health and wellness claim strategy and don't go afield of that. Because when you do, that's where you get a greater likelihood of Federal Trade Commission enforcement, competitors sending letters to FDA and the FTC about you, and states attorney generals coming after you.
So big decisions then, I guess, of which way you're going to pursue. So we are nearing the end of our time slot. I want to thank the panelists for a really engaging discussion and educational overview of the things to think about for regulatory approval and reimbursement strategies for digital health, and Sally for sharing the journey of Renalytix AI, so a company that has charted this path successfully. The slides and a copy of this webinar will be available online for the CTL website in the future. So if there's information you missed or you want to go back and review slides, they will be available. I thank everybody for your time for joining us. We will be having our third and final installment of the webinar on digital health in May. So keep an eye out for that on LinkedIn and other areas, focusing on investors and founders' experiences in launching digital health companies. So I think this is a great progression. I look forward to seeing you all in about a month.